And I'll just like send you the file or a link to it when we're done.
Okay.
Christian friends, I'm older probably. I feel like I'm heading into my senior years, even though I'm like only 47. When did I finish? It was like a long time ago that I finished there in human development and family studies. I had gone to undergrad and gotten a degree in history and a master's degree in social sciences here in Chicago, at University of Chicago. And then I worked as a teacher, a classroom teacher in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where most of my career was. And then I did some work in um, housing. I did a youth services specialist in public housing. And then I realized like I didn't have any kind of sense of like how to track or measure the programs that I was providing services for. And that's what kind of led me to go back to school. I was interested in HDFS. It was in Greensboro. I could get there. I wanted the quantitative parts. And then I also took like a lot of my electives in the School of Education on like ERM, evaluation, program evaluation, and additional statistics courses to make sure that I had that. And then my dissertation was actually racial socialization and its impact on academic achievement. And then I knew I was same place, like floating back and forth, but I had already had some nonprofit experience and I had bills I need to get paid. So went right back into the workforce before I even finished. Like I finished the coursework and my degree program got extended because it was like I was working full time at University Research Center at University of North Carolina at Charlotte, leading a research team there. And then I took another job somewhere else, but like at the local United Way before I finished my dissertation. So I finished, and then it was like a long time at the school district doing 6 or 8 years in a bunch of different positions that were all research, accountability, and like school turnaround programs. Like, and that my whole thing has been racial equity from the beginning, and understanding it. I didn't really have that language even when I was in my PhD program, but it's emerged. And so I'm still focused on that. I've worked a number of other roles in between the United Way or in between the school districts and here, but ultimately where I've landed right now is as the Chief Impact Officer here at Heartland Alliance. And so I'll pause there and then hear what questions you have or how you want to proceed.
Yeah, it's nice to hear kind of like your career trajectory and how you've gotten to where you are now. It was also nice to hear, interesting too, that overall your interest is really racial equity. So for me, while I do have this very detailed, distinct research interest, I think overall I'm starting to realize that for me, it's like, I want a career where I can impact specifically and improve the lives of children of color. So it's good to hear that, yeah, while you had to do this dissertation on this one specific thing, that your kind of general interests have kind of led your career. So that's nice to hear. So I guess my first question that I have for you is, what does a typical day look like for you as Chief Impact Officer at the Heartland Alliance? What are your kind of like primary responsibilities? And are you in a more collaborative role or do you work more independently? I know that was a lot of questions in one.
No, it's all good. I'll give you the overview and then you could, probe.
Mhm.
The role itself is one that was created recently for Heartland Alliance. Like I'm the first Chief Impact Officer for Heartland Alliance. And so what happened is they had a division called Research and Policy, which included a research center that did research both internally, like program evaluation stuff for the programs that Heartland delivers. I'll back up and say just a little 15 seconds about Heartland Alliance. Heartland Alliance is 160 years old. They provide both direct services and kind of systems change work, primarily based in Chicago, a little bit in the surrounding Midwest. And then we have another company, and Heartland Alliance is made up of 5 total companies. But one of them is Heartland Alliance International, which does work internationally. The remaining companies are Heartland Alliance Health, which has federally qualified healthcare clinics and shelter services. Heartland Human Care Services, which has safety programs, economic security programs, and a number of other programs. I mentioned Heartland Alliance International, and then there's Heartland Housing, which does low-cost housing or affordable housing work in the Chicagoland and Midwest. And then there's the parent entity, Heartland Alliance, which my team, the Impact Division, is a part of. I was mentioning that like it started out as a group called Research and Policy, which included a research team which is focused on program evaluation and data analytics for the organization, but also like contracts those services to other nonprofit and government entities. We also have a policy team, and that policy team actually does systems change work, like policy advocacy and lobbying, particularly at the state level. We understand that if we want the systems to change, that we actually have to change the laws. And so we do a lot of policy advocacy work here in the state of Illinois. Occasionally that'll filter either down to the county or city level or up to the federal level, but it's primarily state level policy advocacy. And then finally, we have what we now call our innovation and practice team. And we formerly had an innovation team, a program innovation team, as a separate kind of part of the organization. And my role was to bring them together. So innovation and practice does two things. Program innovation is to pilot new opportunities, new social service, human service programs, and then find a place in the organization for them to live on after assessing kind of their scalability and potential impact. And they also do field building or technical assistance. So that's another thing that we do both internally and offer externally to nonprofit and government clients. But it's basically group facilitation, process development, systems change, field support work that we do. So I lead those teams. Each one of them has like a senior leader that reports up to me. And I sit on the CEO's cabinet to help like make organization-wide decisions, particularly around like how do we use data to measure impact. And then the other piece of like my work is like, what's our data strategy for the organization? It's like not just the measurement of it, but like how do we think about data? Where does it live in the organization? I do that collaboratively with our IT department. And to that other part of the question, it's very collaborative, both across the teams that I supervise. We're always looking for ways to work together. Ideally, every project we work on would have some aspect of each one of our teams, like research, policy, and innovation and practice. So we collaborate internally on our team, but it's also my job is to make sure that we are connecting with either our operational end of the organization, which would be like human resources, finance, et cetera, or with other program services, because we provide direct services to, we call them our clients participants. So we provide direct services to community members and program participants. So it's like, how are we interacting to make sure we hear the voice of the participants in all that we do and make that voice central to our work.
Mm-hmm. And when you say participants, is it, I'm assuming some of, you said like it can be state, county level. Is it coming, I guess, from individuals within the community as well?
Yeah, so mostly it's like when you think about like the other companies that I described, we think about the folks that receive services from those companies. So folks who live in our affordable housing communities, folks who utilize the clinic or shelter services, things like that. And we expand that to say like people who have similar demographics or make up similar communities. In general, I think about it as people who are directly impacted by any of the issues that we're trying to address, which ultimately is social, economic, and racial justice is our mission.
Right. Nice. And so in thinking about the work that you do, it sounds like you do kind of various different things within Heartland Alliance. So I guess, how would you describe your work-life balance? I know like being in academia, like, you have to work, I guess, outside of like business hours. So, which we can also create our own schedules. But I'm just curious, how would you describe your work-life balance? Like, are you working outside of your, I guess, normal work hours, if that exists for you? Do you take work home? What is that like for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because I took this job like in the middle of the pandemic, so I've been remote the whole time. But this is true of just about any kind of what do we call C-suite job, like next to the CEO at a big organization. I start my day usually about 8. And I start checking emails. My first meeting is either at 8 or 9. And then I'm in meetings. And some of those meetings are with my team. Some of those meetings are with members of the CEO's cabinet. Some of those meetings are, external partners. And I'm in meetings probably till about 4 o'clock with probably an hour break at some point, hour and a half. And then it's email from 4 to 5 or so. I try not to work, but in the evenings and weekends, and I do have some flexibility to like set those boundaries. But depending on what's going on in the organization, there's been no week where I was like, I'm done at 5 and that's it, and I'm not working on like it hasn't existed for me. In my therapy sessions, I talk with my therapist about like setting and keeping those boundaries. And I don't know like how realistic that is for this level of position, right? Like I think it's kind of an expectation at this level of the organization that, you work a little more than 40 hours. That said, I don't have that expectation of my team. And I try and help them like set that boundary and not work more than 40 hours.
Okay, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like it is kind of similar to academia in that it really just depends on what's going on. It depends on the week. Sometimes you could be working more, sometimes you could be working less.
That's true. Yeah, I think and I think it depends on the institution too, right? Like for my job, it's like every institution has its norms. Like,
right.
As you're an academic at UNCG, that's different than being an academic at, another institution. It could be right next door. A&T might have different rules, right? Like around or expectations around like when faculty members are present and when they're not. So it really just largely depends on the institution, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think, that's definitely true. That's something that we've been talking about some in our pro-sem course of how things really do differ based on the institution.
One of the things I've learned is just like be very intentional about understanding the culture of the organization you're talking about being a part of. Like every organization, every entity has like unwritten rules. Like even if you think about, your graduate program right now, there are certain things which no one says do this or don't do this, but you figure it out. Right? It's a group norm, it's an unwritten rule, it's part of the culture. So any institution, you're like, okay, I'm going to be a part of this, we're considering it. It's like, what are those unwritten rules? What are the group norms?
That is actually advice that I received from my first informational interview. It's become aware of what is the culture like. So yeah, see a trend with that suggestion. My third question is, how did you even become interested in a non-academic career? And what advice would you give to a graduate student who's interested in a career outside of academia?
Well, for me, my career started outside of academics. So it would have been a transition for me to move into an academic role. And like while I was in my PhD program there, it became increasingly clear to me, like, I didn't want to sit down and write. Like, I just, and Andrea Hunter was my advisor, and
she's on my dissertation committee.
She's amazing and taught me a lot about myself and my strengths and weaknesses. She's a great advisor for me, and still is. And, it just had made me realize that, like, hey, I think my strengths are more like frequent interpersonal connection, coaching, connecting with people and helping them develop, and doing that inside the context of an organization with a mission versus the more independent work of research and writing. And even to like be successful in like a tenure track role, in particular, the amount of research and writing is just, it's hard for me to stay engaged. Even as a graduate student, it was like, I worked on a study with, Dr. Hunter and Dr. Fletcher, and it was like, it's hard for me to stay engaged in this. So just personal preference was what I figured out.
And then I guess, do you have advice or any suggestions for a student who's interested in a career outside of academia?
Go get a job. I'm joking, but I'm serious. Like, there are ways, like, it's a common conversation now in like the job search or field of like translatable skills, right? So think about the skills, like research is one of them, right? And so for me, it's like I took like the knowledge, skills, and abilities that I gained there as a researcher and like translated that into university-based research center and learn more about what I like and don't like there, which then led into philanthropy, and learn what I like and don't like there, which led back into education. So it was like every step of the way I was learning more about myself. But I think the key is just finding an entry point, right? And so taking the skills that you have as before the program and as a result of the program and selling yourself into something that you want to be a part of, and then learn more about yourself there and keep moving.
Right. I know you mentioned you did some nonprofit work before you started graduate school. I'm just curious. So something that some of us have been thinking about or talking about is, we have our research skills that we're gaining while we're in the program, and thinking about how we can, like you said, make those skills translatable. But did you have any or seek out any specific opportunities outside of kind of academia during your graduate career? Or you just mainly focused on, okay, I have these skills, how can I make them translatable once I graduate, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. I think like for me, it was like I had other limitations. So like my search was confined by geography at the time. So it's like I wanted to be in Charlotte. So it was like, okay, well, what can I do in Charlotte? And so my searches were like program evaluation, social services, human services, like anything in any of that realm. And I put in a lot of applications. Remember when I said I finished my coursework and then I went back to work. And so when I finished my coursework, I probably put in like 25 to between 25 and 40 applications in different roles in the Greensboro area and the Charlotte area to see like what was available to me. And so I think the best advice I would give would be like cast a broad net, right? If you see anything that's interesting, like go for it, right? Like so and that I think the biggest limitation can be the limitations we put on ourselves. Or I'll speak from the I. My biggest limitations that I can have are the ones I put on myself. So it was like good for me to just cast a broad net and see what comes back.
And in doing that, so applying for the various positions, I'm just curious, did you find that organizations, these positions that you are applying to, were they receptive, I guess, of the skills that you had gained in your during your graduate career, or was it kind of like, why are you're like in this academic space, why are you now trying to get out of that, or seek an employment outside of that?
Yeah, I don't think anyone like was like resistant to the idea of like entering a different like workspace. I think there were questions. I think that, and it's a difference of, particularly when you're moving to a space that's like direct service. I was fortunate to have some folks who were like in or close to my cohort who came in with MSWs, right? Like I think about Brad Moorfield, I think about Shantae McCoy and a few others. And they, so being around them was helpful to me to understand like what options, sorry, Siri, to understand like what their experiences were and what options they had. And again, no one was resistant. I just had to be able to articulate like how I feel like this is a fit for me. I did learn pretty quickly, like if I go in talking about like racial socialization scales, like that's of no interest to most like direct practice folks or social human services folks at the level of detail that an academic would understand it. So it's like, how do I make this relevant and translatable? It's something I would work on prior to like interviews or even applications.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. It's something that I've been thinking about also, like I said, where I'm like now studying this very specific topic, but I'm like more generally like, not that they don't care, but it's not going to be as relatable to something that I'm likely interested in doing post-graduation. So that makes sense. And so I guess in thinking about the work that you do, what would you say you like most about it, and what would you say you like least about it?
Well, I think the thing I like most about like most of my roles is like the missions. Um,
Mhm.
you know, people could say people enter academia for different reasons. Some might say like they like the mission of knowledge dissemination, and some might say they like the teaching part. I really enjoy teaching actually, but for me to ascend to in the ranks of academia, it's like very research focused. And once I learned that, it was like, oh, I was more interested in being like a teaching professor, and
Mhm.
that's like not as coveted, right, as in most major universities. So what I appreciate is the mission. Like right now, my organization has a mission of racial, economic, and social justice. So I'm always aligned to that. I know when I go to work, like ultimately what I'm working on is something that like I want for the world and for my life. Um, and what I'm like called to do, then the challenge is like you're always doing that inside of an institution. And every institution is influenced by systemic racism and white supremacy. Like it just is. Like if it's in the United States, it is. Like, and you can think about that relevant to, the program you're in that. And like white supremacy shows up in there. Like
Mhm.
um, sometimes organizations are uncomfortable talking about it, but it shows up. And so that's what's challenging to me is like when the organizations that are supposed to be working to combat white supremacy and systemic oppression are not clear on how it's showing up in their own organization. And the only other frustrating thing is like just being under resourced at times in the nonprofit world. It's like, you know, even organizations that are large and have a bunch of money don't necessarily have the human capital, the actual money to like execute on the mission in the way that you would like to. It's not like working for the bank where it's like, hey, as long as it feeds the mission, it can happen. So that can be frustrating also.
Mhm. Yeah, that's understandable. I'm curious. I know you said that you just started your position during the pandemic, but I'm curious if, considering this is kind of like motivated your overall career, this idea of like racial equity with like the recent events of like police brutality being highly publicized. And everyone now is like releasing diversity statements and things like that. Like, have you noticed in your own work that be an increased, I guess, mission or sense of importance?
Yeah, it's interesting because like before I took this role, I started a consulting company in 2008 that does like organizational development and strategic planning work. And I was doing that full time for a couple of years before taking this role. And I did some diversity, equity, and inclusion work in that job. A lot of work I did was helping other nonprofit organizations create plans, like in organizational development and strategic planning work was like the area of focus. Um, and soon after the murder of George Floyd, it was like, to your point, like everyone wanted some diversity, equity, inclusion work. And I did some, and then I became really hesitant about it because I did not see how this was leading to any systemic change. It was, and I noticed that for some organizations, they were doing it as a compliance activity. They were just saying, we need a policy or we need some statement of it. And it was kind of a, let's check the box and move forward. I remember like probably 2 years ago, I sent a tweet that was like, if you're serious about diversity, equity, and inclusion, you should like be pointing dollars towards it. You should have a team built, and that's the way you measure it. It's like, what resources are you pointing towards this work? And then like I saw it recently and like, this is still true, right? A lot of the organizations that 2 years ago, or whenever the murder of George Floyd was, said, yeah, we need to do DEI work, like did that. They released a diversity statement, they hire someone, but their organizations haven't changed. Like, and so for me, like I even before I took this role, considered roles that were diversity, equity, inclusion officers. And I just decided not to because if you didn't have one before, why the urgency now, right? And why did it take the murder of George Floyd and the resulting protests, which is really what like scared organizations into, oh, we need something, in my opinion. And I didn't feel comfortable. And I literally stopped consulting because of that increased demand for that. And I was just saying, no, like, I'm not going to be the guy. I'm not going to be the Black guy who comes in and makes you feel good about like your diversity, equity, inclusion policies. I'm not doing it. I'd rather just go work at an organization that really has this as a mission and where there could be some possibility of systemic change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. An interesting perspective. I imagine that you probably, did experience some increase in that, but interesting too that you decided not to take on that role. I'm also curious, my last question, I want to be respectful of your time. How would you say the skills that you gained during your graduate training, how do you think they've kind of translated into your current role? And are there any skills that you wish you maybe would have gained during your graduate training?
Yeah, the research and the data analytics are huge. Like I can't say it enough. Like this morning I was in a cabinet meeting where we were going through like a presentation about some marketing research and do we need to rebrand the organization? And there was like a correlation table, but the correlations were run on the sample size of like 35 people. And like for me, like I have real clarity on what the data mean. I can advise our CEO on it. I can advise our marketing department on it if they're willing to hear it. And like, so that, and that, I don't know that if you don't get that there where you get that, right? Like you could, if you don't get it in graduate school, it doesn't have to be that program, but if you get that in graduate school, some business schools offer that class, but the degree to which you get it or can get it there is it's valuable. It's super valuable. And for me, that's been the big thing that has translated that. And then like two other things, context, like the ability to contextualize everything. Other folks might not see it as valuable, right? Like you don't talk about that in your interviews, but the idea that like things happen within systems and those institutions are inside those systems. So like micro, macro, meso, like just that construct is huge. And to be able to apply that systems thinking, right, is huge. And then finally, interpersonal interactions, like both personally and professionally, like understanding what's happening in these dyadic interactions, and sometimes group interactions, and like how things get passed, how there's like mutual influence, how groups grow and interact with each other. HDFS was the beginning of my understanding for that, and that's been utilized everywhere in my personal and professional life.
That's good to hear, especially so this data piece you mentioned, like, oh, I can understand correlations and things like that. So something I know some of us have been talking about is having those data analytic skills. And so some of us have been worried, like, oh, do I have the skills to run all of these fancy analyses? And so we have had, some of us have done informational interviews where someone's like, you would be surprised at like just the simple analyses that they actually want. Now it can depend based on, like you said, what organization that you're working in, but a lot of them like it's a simple correlation and ANOVA or something like that. And we're like, oh, wow, like we can do that like it's
Yes.
nothing. So yeah.
Yeah, group comparisons and correlations are the two big things. The most advanced stuff I've seen like in the field are generally regressions. Like
Mm.
a good regression analysis is like, whoa, like yeah. But like the, multivariate, unless you're like going into a space where you're doing that, where you're
Right.
leading statistical analysis for a field, it's rare that you're going to have to utilize a multivariate approach.
Mhm.
I have not utilized that since my class in multivariate, but I'm not an academic, right? If you're an
Right.
academic, you're probably going to need to learn how to do that.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I don't think that I have any additional questions. This was helpful and you provided a lot of helpful information. So I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to do this with me.
Truly my pleasure. I'm glad it's helpful, and you and your classmates can continue to utilize me as a resource. I'll send you this video.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I hope
Thank
that you
you.
enjoy your holiday break and time off.
Oh, yes, you too. Take
Thank
care.
you. Take care.